You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-commerce strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode. Today's episode is sponsored by Centre and Greben. More about them later. We got a fun conversation. It's the flexible work conundrum, balancing business and employee needs to attract and retain talent. So looking at the whole in-office, remote, hybrid, digital team management, which has come back to the fore with Amazon's recent announcement to go to 5 days in the office for everybody. Before I set the scene, give a bit of context, let's do our introductions. We've got two highly experienced digital people, one from client side, one from agency side, so we can bring some interesting perspectives. So Dan, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, thanks, James and Paul. Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Partridge, CEO at Swanky, which is a leading independent Shopify Plus agency headquartered here in the UK, with an office in Australia and a small presence in France also, and a team of about 60.
And interestingly, Dan used to work remotely in France for a few years before relocating back to the UK, hence why we thought this would be a really interesting perspective. So yeah, thanks for joining us, Dan, especially at short notice to both of you and when we're doing this recording. Ross, how about, do you want to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Ross Allsop. I have 10 years in industry as a growth lead at multiple different businesses, currently at Pangaea, a material science apparel brand, where we're looking to redefine the future of apparel and fashion. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And of course, as always, we have myself and the man, the myth, the mystery that is Paul Rogers. So let me just set up the episode and a bit of context before we get into the questions. But there is a split out there in terms of whether being fully remote, hybrid, or in office is the right approach, and different people have different needs. Interestingly, a CBI employment trend survey found that 99% of all business surveyed believes that flexible workforce is vital. But flexible is a really important word because flexibility means different things. Flexible doesn't just mean everyone can work at home all the time. And flexibility has to work for everyone in the team, not just one or two people. And I think what's happened is post-COVID, the scope of opportunity for remote working increased. And then a lot of people started to compete for talent at that level, offering lots of remote hybrid working, and that's set expectations. So what we're going to try and tease and say is what is practical, what is realistic, and how do you manage teams? Because you've got to account for the fact that some people want to be in an office and have that social connection. Others want to be remote, but not all the time. And some people have kids, some don't. So we've got to make sure the flexibility works for everyone. And then we've got angles around diversity and inclusion, and when people go off to have children, whether that's the mothers, the fathers, what are their expectations, what do they need? Is that short-term, long-term? Some people are moving to 4-day weeks because that gives them that work-life balance, but they're still able to commit to being in the office. So there's lots of dynamics around that. And I'm going to use a quote from Sarah Russell, the marketing director at 5874, another e-commerce agency, because they launched the women's domain, which is about championing women in digital and e-commerce. And I thought this quote was quite an interesting debate starter, which is, does the e-commerce industry need flexible working? If we want to attract and retain top talent, keep our teams engaged and provide top-level customer satisfaction, then yes, we do. So with that in mind, Paul, do you want to kick off? Let's get into the first question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think, I'll definitely put into some of these as well, because I feel I've got fairly strong views on sort of this. First question. So as James said at the start, Amazon have obviously announced that or not even really announced, I think they sent like an internal memo around moving back to 5 days a week in the office. So starting with you, Russ, you obviously run a team at Pangaea. I know you've got some strong views on this as well. What's your thoughts on the idea of 5 days a week in the office, and where do you think the balance is?
Yeah. So I come at it from quite an interesting angle. So I guess I'll just start by saying all thoughts of my own rather than that of Pangaea, because I think HR and me have very different views on this. But I think a lot of it's very... it's an interesting conversation because I think difference between brand and agency nowadays are completely different things. I think within brands, we're trying to create a culture And I think that's super important to point that out in terms of how different they are in terms of the output that's actually needed from a team within each and in different departments. I think there's certainly certain departments that aren't necessarily needed and don't contribute to the culture. So I think like certain departments that can work more remotely are not required in the office are key. But when we're looking at teams such as commercial teams, product teams, marketing teams, brand teams, and those kinds of areas, I think it's super important for them to be in the office 5 days a week. I think it's important for them to create a culture to inspire each other, for everybody to be working at the same level and to be presenting themselves at working at the same level. And in areas where you can't present yourself in the office, that you are present in other ways. So, daily catch-ups, that you're actually, being visible to the rest. And I think that goes all the way from exec level down to, entry level. I feel there's no reason now in a brand why you wouldn't be doing that. My opinions on agency probably don't matter too much in this conversation, considering we've got 2 agency leaders here. But I feel that is the area where maybe you can be a little bit more expansive, but also within a brand, teams such as finance that maybe don't contribute towards the output of the business to customers. I think, there's definitely a lot more flexibility there. And I feel like there's probably a few other scenarios that will come up in this conversation where my views will probably slightly differ to that of Paul and Dan's, and probably James's as well.
Grebin create digital flagship stores for iconic brands of today and tomorrow. We are the #1 Centra agency in the world, with more than 50 Centra implementations to date. We are also e-commerce design specialists, platform and tech partner agnostic. Try our new e-commerce design subscription. Visit grebin.com.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would say that, so I think we're, as an agency, I don't know many that are as office-based as us. Like we average about 3 days, with quite a lot of people coming in 5. But all of the people that I know that are doing 5, it's quite a lot of our clients at 5 are all brands. That's one thing I'd say. And I think that type of business will be an interesting discussion about how it differs. But Dan, what's your view on this, and how does Swanky operate?
Yeah, I mean, I probably like Ross, don't lose a lot of sleep around what Amazon do or don't do. I know it creates a lot of storm in the news. It's interesting, but I think fundamentally, I really respect the rights of each business to do what's best for their people, for their customers, and for their stakeholders. And I think the most important thing to me is what's the vision? What are you trying to achieve? Ross just articulated, that sort of potentially in a brand where brand centricity is of increasing importance. How do you foster that across the organization? And I think the question we ask is what's best for everybody? And sometimes that will look very different in different businesses. So I'm quite slow to judge what others do, because you don't know what's going on below the surface. Our journey is shaped by a number of things, really. We are historically a southwest of the UK headquartered business. So in the old world, you might have called us a regional business. But we have a global client base and spend a lot of time in London. So in the olden days, we had a very strong office culture, very strong office presence, and recruited mainly in the southwest. And then, like everybody really, that the pandemic changed our recruitment strategy quite dramatically. We hired very agnostically across the UK and internationally. And I think we're settling upon a bit of a 2-track approach at the moment, which is that we want to both recruit and retain the best talent across particularly the UK, particularly at the senior level. But we're also about to move into new offices, which we're going to invest in quite heavily, which are going to give us a lot of space, going to give us a lot of flexibility. And we're going to encourage folks to be as present as they want to be. And that will come on to some of the reasons for that later on, I'm sure, in terms of the why beneath it. But I think that the sort of the historic view of, there is an answer, I think, as Ross said, I just don't think there is an answer. I think each business needs to understand its people and its mission and find what works for you and stick to it and have conviction. And if that means doing something dramatic, I think that's what leadership's about. It's about finding the path that you need to take and then encouraging others to follow.
Definitely. I think vision's a super important part of that as well, Dan, that you've just mentioned. The other area of this is I've actually worked in, it's more of the south than the southwest in Dorset. Trying to recruit people in certain areas is an absolute nightmare, especially sort of in the tech space, in the marketing space, finding good people in certain areas of the UK where it's not the norm to be sort of in that area, or there's no universities that contribute towards that kind of sector. I think it's really important to be more flexible when you are outside of key cities, like London, Manchester, and where you are maybe a little bit more external. The flexibility probably needs to increase versus the opposite. But then, Paul, you might also have the scenario like yourself where you have expanded into other offices with Vevant, because you've had maybe people that have lived in London previously, that have decided to relocate, that are really good people and you want to retain them. So I do think there's that level where you have to be slightly flexible depending on who the individual is, how engaged they are with the business, what their attitude is, how well you know them. I think are all really important traits to factor in before making a decision. And I think that ties into that agency piece rather than the brand piece, where we're trying to create culture, we're trying to create a brand, everybody needs to live and breathe it, versus a culture of an agency where there's one aligned vision and one aligned goal that is slightly more flexible because you're working with multiple different clients and brands.
Centra is the only commerce platform built exclusively for fashion brands. Over 300 fashion brands run on Centra, including icons like Paul Smith, Jeff, Avenue, and Nudie Jeans. Centra solves business logic challenges for fashion brands like no other platform, and they are on a mission to help you scale up rapidly, globally, across all online and offline channels. Take your fashion brand global, faster, further, stronger today. Yeah, this is why I want to have this conversation, because it's so important that businesses think through what environment they're trying to achieve, as you both said, but the implications on the recruitment side as well. Because if you recruit inaccurately, you set expectations that can't be met, and that's what leads. My wife's had this. My wife needs flexible working because of our various childcare dilemmas with kids and schools. And she's had jobs where they said, we offer flexible working, but they fundamentally don't. And when she joins, it makes life an utter nightmare. And then she's had to leave in order to get it. So I think you're right, that vision and that articulation is critical. So with that in mind, how do you approach like work-life balance? Because I guess if we come back to you first on this again, Ross, because you want to achieve 5 days a week, you can still offer flexibility within a 5 days a week policies. So how do you approach that work-life balance so you don't put good talent off, but equally you have that environment to build the culture?
Yeah. So I run this very different at every business I've worked at. So Pangaea is an interesting one because obviously we have a full HR department who control the narrative of that. It's not really my decision, so I'm not the decision maker within that. We currently operate with a 3 days in the office policy, which is flexible within working times and hours. But once again, we're trying to create a culture. So there has to be that level where we're engaging within the business and engaging with the brand and engaging with the business leaders. So it's super important about that as well. In terms of how I've run things previously, it's very similar when I've been in brands. I have been agency side myself and things were a lot more flexible at that point, but that was more pre-COVID. During the other brands, once again, I was at Through Dark for 3 years. That was a very sort of office-led culture. It was work hard, play hard. We did long days. We did sort of, 10-hour days most days because we were all so engaged with the brand and the vision of the brand. It was just super important. We were all aligned in terms of the output, that we were sat next to the founders, asking them questions. And it's been very similar in a lot of small businesses I've worked in. Pangaea is slightly different because the founders are sort of based in multiple different locations in the world. But what we do have is we have, leaders within the company director level that are sat in the office, influencing, different individuals, answering questions, signing things off. So, I think it's super important to create that culture. I think from my side, the way to navigate it is more around being able to cater for things like parenthood. So like yourself, James, where you maybe need slightly more flexibility with the working day. I think every company's culture should format to the way that they need it to. So if that's 5 days in the office, but they finish at 2:30 every day to go and pick their kids up from school, and they have that flexibility to work the rest of the day from home, I think that's fair enough. But having that daily touch point within the brand from my side is really interesting. And I think I definitely notice the difference when I'm not in the office in terms of how much output I get from my team and other teams that are influential, just when I'm not there or we don't have one of our senior or heads of departments there. So I think both of those things are super important, and obviously something that you need to factor in to your state of play. So yeah, but I think, it's different. Other brands can do it well because they are more international. Pangaea is a relatively international brand itself. So, I think maybe there's flexibility there. And we have a lot of international people that work within the business and, want to see their families, want to have that work-life balance. So I think, once again, it's something that needs to be flexed, but with, an aligned vision there.
Yeah, I think that the distinction between whether you're in office or not and flexibility is being in office doesn't preclude flexibility. I think that's a really important point. And my wife now has a job where she can, if she needs to, do the school drop and be in later, and she can work later, or she can go early to pick up the kids, and then she can continue working from home. And it works, and it takes the stress away, and she's a much happier employee, and her productivity goes up as a result of that. So Dan, let's come to you. Like, how do you approach things from an agency perspective in terms of that work-life balance?
I mean, I think for us, it's really important. I think one of the reasons people join us is that we're perceived as a really nice place to work. We've got amazing founders, there's a kindness and a gentleness, I think, that runs through our culture, whilst also being incredibly ambitious and incredibly hardworking. So I think most of our people, we recruit very carefully around the cultural piece anyway. We want to safeguard that. I think there's a few moving parts. I think that clearly having a great in-office experience somewhere in the mix it's a bit of a non-negotiable now. As Paul said, I think there is a gravitational pull towards people wanting to be together, wanting to rekindle friendships and relationships. Like we all suffered in different ways during the pandemic, and I think unpicking that is taking time. So I think that's important. I think actually having a good work-life balance does involve stretching out life away from a kind of homogenized, I get up, I eat my cereal, then I sit down, then I work for 8 hours, and then I go to my kitchen and I cook. And I think for some of our folks that has been a really traumatic chapter of their lives. Clearly others have thrived upon it. And I think one of the things we've really differentiated around is seniority within the business and the types of role that people are doing. So to give some illustrations, we've hired some very senior people in the last 2 or 3 years on a fully remote basis who are 15 years into their career, who know exactly what they want, for whom remote working, potentially with a garden office or a dedicated home space that fits around family commitments, that enables travel and other priorities, is a really crucial thing. And that's some of our highest performing, most loyal, capable, wonderful people. On the other extreme, we've got some really talented junior people who are at the beginnings of their career. And we think actually for those folks, probably an inflection towards an office environment is really, really important. Now, we're not in London, but we are in a city. And I think there's something about early in your career gravitating towards cities, gravitating towards more senior people, an environment which is that sort of very driven, very processed, very structured sort of place is crucial. And I think a lot of people who have been earlier in their careers have been hit hardest actually by the fallout of the pandemic. And I think one of the things we have to be careful about in all of this is obviously looking after everybody within our teams. But I think sometimes the argument around flexibility can actually impede those who are earlier in their careers and actually can create suboptimal conditions for them. So I don't think there's one size fits all. I think we're all different, aren't we? And I think for us, it's about creating a sense of entrenched flexibility, but also within a structured context. And there's a dynamic there that we all have to figure out and flex in different ways. But fundamentally, we want to be a great place to build a career. So we have to look after people. But we also want to be a great place to build a career. So we have to achieve great outputs and great results and help people flourish in their careers. So we're just walking that tension like everybody is, really.
Yeah, I think this is one of these. There's no perfect approach to this. There's a key thing I hear from most people. Interestingly, because I know a few businesses exactly like you, Ross, who have a minimum number of days, like 3, others who want to go more towards the 5 in the office. And I've got another client who's got 1 day in the office and that is it. And it works for them within their culture, but you have to know your culture in order to get the right setup. Paul, I know you'll probably have something quite keen to say this, because you've got 2 parts of the business. You've got your e-com consultancy and you've got paid media. And paid media is obviously it's strategic, but it's also very tactical and reactive. So what's the dynamic with you guys and how do you approach that balance?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because that's where I was going to go with it, actually, because I think our e-com consultancy team is a team of 8. It's far more deliverables based. Half the time we're working towards kind of one big meeting or one big presentation. So there's a lot of room to be flexible. And yeah, I'd say our team are a lot more flexible in terms of how we work, and we travel a lot for client work, etc. Whereas the paid team, I think in terms of the flexible working, it's harder. So we have done it in places, but we are typically fairly 9 till 5:30. Just because of the nature of the relationship with the client and kind of the ways of working. And we do adapt, like we do like summer working hours and stuff like that. But I would say it's a bit more challenging with kind of how that relationship works and how we've kind of, the way that our service has been created to allow for like proper flexibility, I would say. One other thing I was going to say to you, I think you kind of touched on this, Dan, but I think one of the reasons why we are very office based, so we've got essentially around 55 people that would be in office and 5 people that are remote. And the fact that 4 of them are in and around Exeter is completely random, actually, and they don't actually meet up that often, so they're looking at doing more of an office space there. But I would say the people that have, one of the reasons that we do this is because we invest a lot in juniors. So I say juniors, like we hire a lot of like what we consider to be very sharp graduates, and a big part of our business is basically getting them trained up within the first year to be able to take on more billable work. And one thing that I would say we've definitely noticed is that in office results in people developing and learning faster, and also kind of feeding off each other in terms of how you might approach a client, all of that kind of stuff. And I think that, and like the ways that calls are handled are definitely a big part of why we are so office based. And one other random trend that I wanted to highlight, just because Dan, you talked about the impact of COVID. I think one thing that we've noticed recently is one of the biggest impacts, particularly with kind of like I say, we've tried to like hire like younger, more junior talent and then kind of nurture them and develop them really quickly. And we've definitely kind of invested in that kind of like academy style kind of training experience. Is that a lot of those people haven't had the opportunity to travel. And I actually think one of the biggest impacts, I don't know, you've seen it, Ross, or you've seen it, Dan, but I think one of the biggest impacts I've seen over the last year is definitely people that maybe a lot of their friends or, you know, siblings or whatever else traveled post uni. And then now, you know, they want to either work remotely for prolonged periods of time and travel, or, you know, take 6 months out, 12 months out. So I think that's definitely something that I've seen, not just in our business, but other agencies mentioned as well.
It's nomad lifestyle, isn't it, I guess, because obviously a lot of them are looking for that sort of dream lifestyle of working from the beach, working from a bar, that kind of thing. You know, and I think that's something that's great if you're an agency, because I think there doesn't need to be so much emotional connection to your particular agency or brand. But when you're within a business like a Pangaya, for example, or like a Through Dark or like a Loki, you know, you need to be living and breathing that, and you need to be inundated with, I guess, influence from the business leaders, influence from the founders, and actually understanding what the vision is for that brand on a daily basis, because it changes so much. It's so dynamic. I think the other thing I agree with Paul is, you know, investing in young people. The e-com space has changed completely in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think it's super important that with agencies, you know, which a lot more brands are going to be relying on as we start to make more agile teams to weather the storm in fashion, for example, is that you're investing in those people who are learning from people like yourself and Dan, from yourself, to actually like influence them to bring a new era of people that are going to be, you know, amazing in the space of the next 5 to 10 years. You know, the industry that I'm in has always heavily relied on people with lots of experience. But I think nowadays the gap between somebody with 25, 30 years of experience and somebody with 10 years of experience is so slim now because of COVID and because of the way things have panned out. You know, it's a very different industry to what it was 5, 6 years ago. So I think, you know, big credit to you, obviously, to invest in the future rather than just sort of investing in experienced team members that are going to, you know, give you a steady pair of hands. I think taking more risks with younger people, which, you know, you're going to get easily 50% of them that are going to be absolutely amazing just because they're so quick to learn and they're so keen and have a good attitude to work towards those things.
Yeah, it's quite a big... There's quite a big challenge, I think, because we're sort of similar, Paul. We've got a good relationship with XD University, and we've had a number of masters grads join us in the last couple of years. And I think that because whichever approach you take, there are going to be weaknesses with it, and I think that's another thing to call out. Like, there is no perfect employer, there's no perfect environment, there's no perfect model. You know, you're sharing a opinionated view, Ross, which is incredibly important, and you have conviction, but it's not perfect, and it has weaknesses and it has blind spots, as does our approach, as does Paul's approach. And I think one of the tensions I see longer term with what we're doing, and we want to think about carefully, is if we recruit experienced talent geographically quite agnostically, because we just need the right people that can serve clients' complex requirements, you know, large, complex, multi-stakeholder projects, you need 10 years plus experience to do that typically. And we have folks around the country who sort of fit that mold. Then you bring in your kind of very smart graduate type, you know, early career program, and you foster a sense of learning and trajectory internally. Brilliant, love it. I think it's similar to what we're trying to do. One of my questions then is actually, how do we evolve the business so that in 2 or 3 years' time, we almost don't have this kind of 2-track thing going on where you have one culture in the office, you have one group of people that have sort of been through that formative shaping experience together, who are going out for dinner and drinks after work, who are going doing CrossFit, as half my team seem to do, before work, versus those who are maybe, got a few more grey hairs like 1 or 2 of us, who actually are, very much remote first, might come to the office environment once a quarter or once a month, maybe actually aren't involved in some of those social dynamics. Is that okay? Is that just a kind of a natural consequence from the model we've pursued and just comfortable with it? Or actually, is there a further response needed in a year or two? And we go, what, we've created another problem for ourselves here. We've got to reflect again.
You do. I'm surprised you're not a CrossFitter, to be fair, Dan. I was looking at your traps there and I was thinking maybe you were. But yeah, I mean, I guess in terms of that, like, I think you do run that risk, right? So I think in businesses I've been in previously, there's really been that segregation between, the sort of more mature level staff and the more staff on the ground. And then it's kind of up to us sort of 30, 40 types to sort of bring everyone together. And I think that puts huge pressure on people like who are heads of departments, maybe director level or low level director level, to actually bring the teams together, unite them and help them understand each other. Because I think the gap between them is so big. Whereas I think the gap between nowadays, like I said, between people with 10 years of experience and 25 years of experience is not a lot, just because of the things that have happened in the last few years. But I think it's super important to build that culture around everyone. And I think a few brands that I've worked for, have seen that segregation between the founders or C-suite and, maybe like junior level team members that actually they maybe don't think that they know who they are or that they don't respect them because there's maybe not that there's not that connection in the office of actually going for drinks after works, doing things like CrossFit together. Paul, I know you're a huge advocate. I get invites all the time to go to One Rebel and do spin classes and those kinds of things. So I think, that's a great thing to do to unite people and show that the founders do see you and that you are visible, because I think what that translates to is that in work, then the founders see exactly what you're doing. They do recognize that you're doing a good job. And I think if you do have that too remote policy where everything is super disconnected, I think what ends up happening is you find team members become demotivated a lot quicker than what they probably did years ago where we were all in the office more frequently. So yeah, I mean, it's a good point. And I think, how do you tackle that? I think it is up to, director level, heads of departments to sort of merge those two together, encourage both sides to connect, I think is like really important. And that it's not sort of all on the C-suite to make those actions, or it's not all on the juniors to inspire those actions, and actually that we have a responsibility of those people who are maybe not business founders, but sit on a C-suite or directorship level to bring those two together. So I think that's a really important thing that should happen over the next few years.
I also think one of the key changes is that social piece and what being sociable means to different people. If I go back to when I first started out in London, before I had grey hair in my beard, everything was about going out and getting drunk. That was it. Literally, the whole social scene was, we're going to the pub, we're going to a bar, we're going to a party. But what I know about most, not most, but a lot of, I guess, younger generation of people in digital is that, yes, some people want to go out and get drunk, but not everyone does. And you've got the religious dynamic. You've got people for cultural and religious reasons who don't drink. And one of the big challenges on this is building sociability into a business that isn't geared around one particular activity. And I think that's definitely a challenge from a diversity point of view. So, which leads me on to my next question. We'll come back to you first on this one, Ross, is like working conditions obviously play an important role in attracting talent, as you were talking about keeping people motivated. When you're recruiting, like, what are you hearing? What are people really looking for? What questions are people asking? What are they expecting from an employer?
Yeah, I mean, it does depend a lot on, one, the brand, but two, also the role and the seniority of the role. I think the majority of who I see are looking for, I guess, understanding and flexibility within their personal situation. Like I said, at Pangaea, we have a lot of international, team members that, have families abroad, or they have, partners that maybe work away or different things. So I think it's the understanding of the culture is to be in the office as much as possible, but with flexibility, understanding and trust. And I think that's ultimately what all employees are looking for now, is they just want to know that the company, not just me, is aligned, but also the company trusts them to do their jobs correctly. And that whether that's in the office or outside of the office, we trust them to do that. If they've got appointments, we give them the flexibility. I've been at a few brands, previously that, expect you to book a day's holiday if you have a doctor's appointment for an hour, and I think that's probably the worst culture that could possibly exist, is actually there's that real lack of understanding and respect for the employee. It goes down to micromanagement level, doesn't it? Is if that carries on, employees just become more and more demotivated. I've always been a big advocate of, if you put more into your team, if you inspire, if you're the sort of person that is there in the office, or at least has that visibility of showing that you're presenting yourself in a hard-working perspective, that will influence other team members to work harder. The incentives need to be there. I think that's super important, is having some sort of development plan or roadmap to where you're going to go next, regardless of if you've just started. I think a lot of businesses avoid that conversation of development plans for each individual. And I think really what we should be doing is engaging with that and actually saying, look, I'm going to set you on a development plan because you need to know where you're heading next. So I think that's the thing, is it's respect and understanding development. Is there anything there? Whether that's sometimes, 9 times out of 10 now, it's not actually just about money. It's about, how do I get myself to that next level? How, everyone's so ambitious nowadays. We need to find ways to sort of make them ambitious within their day-to-day role, but also in the future. And what does that look like for them? So I think those two things are really what people are looking for. Rather than flexibility, remote working, it's more the understanding of their own situation, and that every situation is unique. So.
Yeah, I had a classic example of that one of you've got a dentist appointment, right? You've got to take a half day's holiday, and how much it pissed off and alienated entire teams at an agency I work for. And I was told by the owners, no, that's what everyone else does. And I, as a senior manager, had to basically act as a shield and let my team go and take that time off without doing annual leave, because I knew I'd end up losing my skilled team and take the wrath of it, because they were working so many extra hours, coming in early, doing evenings. Some even did work on the weekends when we had like major campaign hits or big issues around launches, an e-com agency. And it was insane. So they weren't getting paid extra for that. That was them being motivated and working hard, to not give them the flexibility back when they most need it. I'd have somebody also whose wife had postnatal depression, and he suddenly needed, at short notice, every now and then to go home and take the pressure off. It's like, if you cannot give people that, you're not respecting them. Your productivity drops massively and you will lose them. So yeah, exactly. I think this is why flexibility doesn't necessarily mean you don't need to be in an office. It's about, I like the way you framed it, understanding.
And respect, I think, super important. It's respect for their own individual position. And I think if you give everyone that same level of respect, the rest of the team respect that as well. I've never had, and I have an extremely amazing team at Pangaea right now. I would consider every single one a friend, which I know as a leader you shouldn't say, but I think they're just people who I would surround myself with for the rest of my life. And I think the way I've done that personally is maybe through influence, or maybe it's just the fact I've got lucky. But I think if you show every single one that same level of respect for their own unique situation, they will end up respecting each other far better as well. And I think when there's, the other thing I've noticed just within the current team I have is when there's conflict in other departments, we handle it with kindness, rather than in a lot of businesses I've been in, it's been a defensive sort of atmosphere. So I think, super positive for the culture at Pangaea itself. But I think also, I think that's come with a level of respect from all of the business leaders at the company. And I think, that is a super important thing to flag. But yeah, I think, flexibility means a million different things. And I think people have got it into their heads too much that that means in the office or out of the office. It's actually, everybody is unique. Everybody is a person. We're not numbers. I've worked for huge corporate brands in my more junior years of my career, where I was just seen as a number. I knew the founder didn't know my name, just saw me as another number. And I think all it does is push you into that demotivational stage. And Dan, I don't know so much about yourself, but I've worked with Paul on and off for the last sort of 4 or 5 years. And I know himself and Josh and the other leaders at Vervont have always had, visibility with even the most junior members of the company, even as they've grown to 50, 60, 70. So I think that's a really important one to flag.
Yeah, nice segue over to you, Dan, on what do people really need? What are people asking you, and what are you trying to provide?
I think when you're recruiting, just transparency, clearness, clarity. At the recruitment stage is really important. So we're recruiting roles at the moment which are fully in office. We're recruiting roles which are fully remote. And that is, in a sense, setting a path for those people when they join us, that they have clear expectations of what their dynamics will be. I think for our remote first folks, they're generally really reassured to know that there is, a good office environment that they can come and be part of. We have a travel budget for them to make sure they're down at HQ, at the appropriate cadence. Typically that's monthly or quarterly, but it depends. We've got a big team day today for our managed services team. So there's about 25 people in a hotel having a whole day together. Lunch, they'll do things after work, I'm sure. There's games, there's silliness, there's some really serious stuff. They're wheeling me out to do some, I don't know, whatever they need me to do. That's really important as well. And I think, I think currently we're just about charting the course that we want to and navigating it well. And clients similar, of course, in the way that they want to engage with us. So we have long-standing international clients that we don't typically spend very much time with in person, if at all. It's the exception that you would see them at an event or for a meeting, whereas others actually really value the chance to come and see us and prospect as well. We've had prospects come and see us recently and come and spend a whole day with us, just as they're evaluating how do we function as an organization? How would we be to work with? Would there be a culture fit and a rapport there? So I think, again, just being really transparent and clear and honest with people. And I think you just can't be duplicitous as a leader. So if you're bringing somebody in under one guise and then suddenly you hard left, oh no, we're all going to come back to the office now full time. I don't care that you live 3 hours away. You've just got to figure it out. That's the sort of stuff that really upsets people, quite rightly, because it would upset all of us to be in that scenario.
Yeah. Paul, how about from your side?
Yeah, I think a couple that I was going to add to it. Well, I think Ross's point, I think it was you that raised it. I think the flexibility point, like I said, I think people at the minute, there's a big focus on travel. Like we've hired a lot of good people, and one of their kind of, not necessarily non-negotiables, but one of the big motivations, and this doesn't come up all the time, it does come up a lot, it's like, I want to do 2 months away and I'm happy to work for even 2 months or work for 6 weeks and combine it with holiday or whatever else, but they want to do some level of travel because, like I said, they've just not managed to do it before. So I think that's something we've seen quite a lot of and have kind of adapted. Because I would say, again, like Josh and Beth Ann are both from kind of large agency background, and on the paid side, there hasn't always been loads of flexibility, particularly pre-COVID, where now I think we've kind of had to adapt around that. I would say a lot of people prioritize culture now, and again, I think a lot of that's come. I actually think one of the reasons why people prioritize that is because I think particularly a lot of the really large media agencies off the back of COVID have ignored in office, have ignored maybe culture and kind of, transitioned maybe too far in the other direction. I think a lot of people are looking to work for smaller businesses and have that opportunity to like build deeper relationships and learn from each other face to face and that whole piece. So I think that, and just generally, having more meaningful relationships with the people they're working with, I think is a big one. And the last one, I would say, I think just as the world has changed, I think we definitely get asked a lot more around kind of areas of how we're operating as a business from like a consciousness perspective. I think DE&I is massive, and it's something where there's like an expectation now where businesses should be investing in. It's something that we've definitely tried to invest in more, and we're definitely not perfect, but we're continuously trying to kind of improve areas around that, different policies and kind of procedure, generally kind of like how the business is operating as well. I definitely think a good proportion of people we're interviewing are asking more around like the ethics of the business and kind of how we're operating now, and then how we plan to change as well.
Interesting. I've for a long time believed that cultural value is like a brand value for working for from a merchant side, that people who want to work in agencies, there's a strong community of people who want to buy into a culture, and the culture adds the value to them and reinforces that they want to work in that place, and therefore the culture is really important in keeping people, and people don't always have to have the highest salary to actually be the happiest. Obviously money is important, people need to be rewarded, but sometimes you eschew a higher salary to be within a cultural environment that allows you to really enjoy yourself. It's a bit actually as a solo consultant, and I'm a solo consultant because of my life stage and because of the kids and the dynamic my wife's working. I can't be in an agency 3 to 4 days a week. I just can't make it work. The bit I miss the most is that culture, which comes back to Ross, your point about building a brand. That's a bit I miss the most, but I know that I have to miss it because I can't commit to that level of in office. So I got one more question actually. We've kind of moved around, we've answered lots of the other questions we're going to get into. But the one I really want to go, and maybe we'll come back to you first on this, Ross, again, and then to you, Dan, is do you measure the value of flexibility, or what are the benefits? Because I've seen a lot of stats out there about, 75% of managers say flexible working conditions improves productivity. Company X says they save 3% of cost by being more flexible, that there's a reduction in cost of not needing so much office space by having hybrid working. Lots of data flying around. So I'd love to know, Ross, do you measure the benefits of the business of a flexible approach? Or are you not worried, you just believe it's the right way to go?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a little stigma about this. I remember when I was working in earlier in my career in Bournemouth, there was a HR director that said to me that basically having the temperature of the room at 19 degrees increased productivity. And I think there's a load of tosh out there like that stems from that. I think productivity is subjective because, especially in a brand, it's all about results and the output. You can have somebody that's extremely smart and works 4 hours a day and will give you the same output as somebody who works 8 hours a day. And I think that's a really important thing to flag here, is that when you're in a brand, and for me personally as a business leader, I don't strictly know this because I don't actually measure how many hours my team works, because most of the time I know that they're working day, night, and I think that's super important, but it's because they want to, it's not because we're making them. And I think, sometimes that means that they might take some flexibility in the day. There might be times in the day where they need to take some time out to go to a doctor's appointment or do something for themselves or go to the gym or something like that. So I think from my side, it's all about results. And I think that's what deems productivity, is not necessarily productivity in terms of hours, which I think is how maybe your Amazons of the world will measure things, is how many hours can we get out of this person if we give them flexible working versus working in the office. And I know there's been some huge studies, especially in the Nordics, about 4-day working week, right? I think there'll be people that go to a 4-day working week and do a 10-hour day, 4 days a week. So you still get the same amount of hours, so it looks great in terms of the press. It looks great how it's presented. I think that's good for them, but ultimately that doesn't breed productivity. That doesn't breed results. So I think all of it is down to influence. It's down to culture. It's down to respect from employee to business. I think that's super important. And I think it's about just trusting them, and I think if you can get someone who can work for you 4 or 5 hours a day that delivers the same as somebody in another business who works 12 hours a day, I think that's credit to them. That's just my personal opinion, not that of any brand I've ever worked in, but I think that's a level of respect we should have for our employees nowadays, is exactly that, rather than measuring every hour, measuring productivity in and out of the office. But I do think there's a mental health association with culture and social, because I think that is something we did lose through the pandemic, is the social element of a business being connected to our peers, being connected to our, employers, I think is like a really important one, but also being connected to the benefits of having an office culture, going for drinks after work, doing team building. I like to take my team out at least once a month. And we don't just go for dinners or drinks, we do loads of different things. We go to gigs, comedy, that kind of thing, to try and, bond on a different level, so you have that level of respect to each other. I might sound like a super uncool dad saying things like that, and I'm sure that's what they'll think when they hear this, but I think it's super important to have that culture above and beyond just flexibility and how much we have to give them. I think it's about give and receive, and it being a two-way street.
Yeah, I really like that approach, and it's that diversity, isn't it? Because if you want to achieve diversity and inclusion, you've got to have a diverse approach to things. You can't just have a one size fits all. So I really like Dan. How about Swanky approach? So do you measure the value? Do you track it, or is this again just about this is our belief, this is the right way, and therefore we're going to go with that?
Yeah, I mean, we measure lots of things. I don't know that we explicitly measure this one, but a few relevant things that might be of insight to folks. So we do a biannual appraisal process, like lots of businesses, but we're in it at the moment. It's very labour intensive. So we're understanding how each person in each team is feeling, how they're enjoying their job, how they're performing, how their manager feels about their role, how their peers feel. And we twin that with an employee net promoter score. So we run an NPS internally to understand, is Swanky a good place to work? Would you recommend that friends come and work here? Would you choose this job again? And we've consistently had really pleasing results, which suggests that something is going broadly in the right direction. Equally, the feedback we get where things aren't as good as they should be, people didn't like a certain decision or feel uncomfortable with a certain dynamic in the business, we can then feed that back into the kind of the planning and the vision. I think productivity is such a funny one, as Ross said. Like I come from my previous career was as a corporate lawyer, and you're very much wed to the notion of the billable hour and productivity. And I think there's just such a tension here. Like Swanky is a professional services business, like a law firm or an accountancy firm in some ways. And on the one hand, yes, our clients need and require clearly a professional service, but also a measure of output. But quite often, as Ross said, we're not being measured by the inputs and how long you spend at a desk and when that time spent at a desk. Actually, it's did you launch this project on time? Did you find a solution to this complex issue? Did you bring operational or commercial value to us through the digital services that you provided? And I think we have to ask the same things about our people, which is, are you flourishing? Are you building your career in the way that you would like to, which might be on a more or less ambitious trajectory? Is that going well? Are we happy and are you happy? And ultimately, are our clients, singing our praises because they get exactly what they need and more from working with Swanky? So I think that, there's a holistic set of measurements you can apply to stuff. But to go granular and go, look, we saved X% on overhead by moving away from an office model, or we increased productivity by 17% by getting everybody back in at the caged hens in the booths in the office or whatever it is. I mean, that legacy model, it's just dead, isn't it? And those that perpetuate it are not going to flourish.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say, just to, on the back of that, is it's important with how you manage your employees, and not to go off piece, but in terms of how you manage your agencies and stakeholders as well, is actually, this isn't just about how you manage your employees. I think everybody should be given that flexibility of, hours. There might be some agencies you work with who don't necessarily work on the same time zones as you and things like that. And I think that's really important, is you show that mutual respect of every stakeholder you're working with. So not just your employees, because I think that's also how you get the best out of your agencies. And I think, there's a common term of phrase of people, who are in my role, who your agencies are only as good as the people managing them. And if you don't know where to put people in the best positions, or you don't know when it's time to change it up, or you don't know if it's best to maybe switch out a team member or discuss that with the founders. Paul, I know my time with you guys, we've had these conversations of maybe there's certain team members that certain different businesses better because of the way we operate, because of the way I am, because of the way the team are. I think it's super important you look at that, but look at that on an employee level as well and go, is this employee the best fit for this particular team? Do they need to move teams? And how does that business structure need to work? So, I think that's super important as well to flag and discuss.
I do think a really good follow-up episode would be that piece around the agency-client relationship as well. So I do think you're particularly good at, you're very unique, I would say, as a client, and all over the place and very different to all of our other clients. But I think you're very good at getting teams motivated. So I do think that would be, particularly our team, and, very quick to reward people with product, all that kind of stuff. So I think that would be a good follow-up. I was basically just going to say the same thing around subjectiveness of productivity. And I think I've actually had feedback from people, because not everyone wants to come to the office 2 or 3 days a week. But now we enforce 2 days as a minimum. And quite often I'll hear the comment, I'm not as productive in the office, so I don't get as much work done. But I personally think, again, it's like the other value is intangible. And it's like, that's where you're building relationships, learning from other people, seeing what people are doing on different accounts. You're, talking to people you wouldn't talk to every day, which adds value to the culture. And we do our annual retreat, which is next week, which is always an interesting debate. And we've done that from the start. We did it with 6 people, and we're now doing it with 60 people. And the main thing that I say about that, and again, we get questioned around it, and it costs a lot of money and everything else, but one thing I would say is that I think there's so much value in having different groups of people talking about different things. And a big part of that 3-day retreat is actually getting different people challenging different people in different teams that wouldn't usually work together. And also unifying and aligning on processes, all of that stuff. But I think, again, it's intangible, but I personally think it's always been super valuable to us, both from a retention perspective, but also, and I also think from a retention perspective, relationships is probably the most valuable thing that you can build to retain people. If you can build a culture where, like you're saying, Russ, where people are friends at work, and people can share stress, people can learn from each other, but also just become friends. I personally think that's the best way to retain people.
Yeah, and feeling comfortable about addressing anyone at the business, I think, is really important as well. Is for example, Paul, you might have juniors that speak to you in the same way your director level people speak to you, because they feel like they can be open and honest with you. And I think that's one of the things is no longer are we managing teams. We are aligning and putting strategy into teams, but we are not necessarily having to manage people like maybe years ago you had to when it was a very office-based culture. I think nowadays it's more about influence. It's more about them aspiring to maybe become more like you, I guess, or maybe having things that they see from your personality that they'd quite like to implement in their own life. And us being business leaders rather than being managers. And I think that's a really important thing to flag. And I think all the good agencies I work with, for example, the good brands I know have leaders with that kind of influence. So, people like Charlie at Docs, I've seen her quite a few times with her team, and just, the way she holds herself and the way her team look at her, it's like they genuinely respect her. And I think that's the really important thing here, is having that mutual respect that I'm sure she shows them back as well. So, a really important one for the future, but also for founders, entrepreneurs, in terms of how they're building their businesses, is always to show that two-way street of mutual respect, understanding, rather than management or micromanagement. Because I think we're just going the complete opposite way to that sort of like how things used to be, which I'm sure, Dan, when you were a corporate lawyer, that's how things were. It's billable hours, how to be managed, how to get you to do more with less, all these kinds of things that used to be standard practice. Now it's about output and what we can do with the time that we have got.
I think another good follow-up, I know, James, we're running out of time, but again, I think it would be quite a useful one to cover at some point, because I think Charlie is probably, I'd put you in the same bracket, Russ, but one of the best client-side team leaders I've ever worked with, and I think she's particularly good at constantly thinking of new ways to motivate the team. She basically operates like an agency, I would say, and she's constantly trying to connect people across different teams, get people involved in different projects in the business, but also bringing in external people to motivate the team, get people inspired, get them thinking 2 steps ahead. And I do think that from a brand perspective would be a really good episode as well. But James, I'll let you wrap up now.
Well, and I'll just say this conversation is really interesting. I would happily carry on for a long time, but I don't think our listeners would last 3 hours worth of discussion. Although there are lots of potential follow-ups, and we'd love everyone to add comments on the post and let us know what you think, because I think what's come out of this quite clearly is this is about flexibility. It's not about being in office or it's being remote. It's about understanding and respecting your team and giving them an environment that they can thrive in. And there's quite a lot of comments that each of you have come up with. It's resonated with me from when I used to work. Because I've worked client side as head of ecom, I've worked agency side as a ecom consultant and heading up digital marketing teams. I've worked as an independent consultant with so many businesses. See all sorts of approaches. But that evolution thing you're all talking about, which is, this is about not having a rigid hierarchy, not forcing people to be, you've got to work 8.5 hours a day. It's not how life works. It's about productivity and outputs and respect and people delivering on what's expected of them. And if you're right, I mean, the bit of you need an hour to go to the gym, but actually your afternoon's work is going to be shitloads better because you're really energized now, rather than us forcing you to sit back at your desk when you're knackered. It's little things like that to me is where the evolution of this work-life balance has gone. And office versus remote is just one small consideration within this wider framework of managing environments for employees and businesses. So Ross, Dan, really appreciate you jumping on. Really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed listening to both your perspectives. And if anyone's got any questions for us or wants to continue the debate, reach out. You can connect with us on LinkedIn. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as us. And make sure you're following us on LinkedIn. You'll get updates on all our latest episodes. Till next week, everyone. You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast, hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-com strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode.